It is possible. Generally speaking, for example, in earthquakes, where we often get a lot of this sort of collapse, you may have people who survive up to about 14 days. When a large reinforced concrete frame building collapses, you might expect there to be something like a 15% void space. In that, there may be people. Now, if they're severely injured, they'll probably last between an hour and 3 days, but not more. But if they're more or less intact, then they may last 10 days or longer. There won't be many people in that condition, but it is still worth looking at this stage.
And that begs the other question, why it's taken several days to account for all those who are still missing.
Well, firstly, you have to track down and find anyone who has survived or who wasn't at home or anything like that. And no doubt the first thing that the search and rescue crews will have done would be to interview survivors to try to find out where people who might be trapped under the rubble are likely to be located. In other words, where to concentrate the search. Secondly, anything up to 4 tons of equipment per squad has to be assembled. You'll have something like 28 people going into action there. This is all now very well practiced, very tried and tested, because this sort of building collapse is not uncommon around the world, usually in earthquakes, but also spontaneously in various places. So there are tried and tested procedures for urban search and rescue, but it has to be done very delicately. If you start using heavy earth moving equipment, then you risk cutting a person in half who might still be alive. However, very soon it'll be the case that the majority of rescues, where there are rescues, will be bodies rather than live people, I fear.
And because this is a partial collapse, David, what are some of the underlying complications here for the rescue authorities?
Well, it reminds me very much of 9/11, New York City, and Building 7 of the World Trade Center, which collapsed at 5:20 in the evening. In other words, 8-9 hours after the initial beginning of the disaster. And as they searched under the rubble, 1.2 million tons of rubble there, they had to be very, very careful for fear that there would be a spontaneous collapse. So they were keeping very close watch on it. They had procedures available immediately to evacuate the rescuers if it should begin to teeter. And no doubt they'll be doing exactly the same in Miami. But they are pretty used to this.
Yeah, so from where you are sitting, what are the next steps in this emergency? What do you foresee happening over the coming days?
Well, I think they'll continue for a while longer, this round-the-clock search for people trapped under the rubble, which, as I say, will turn into a search for bodies. They'll attempt to get out all the bodies, and then they'll start to use heavier equipment to move the rubble itself. And that will then turn into an investigation of why all of this happened, probably a judicial investigation as well. So we might regard this as a potential crime scene after the emergency phase has died down. And at that point, they'll be able to move large pieces of rubble, for example, plates of concrete or concrete beams. But if they do that right now, and if anyone is alive and trapped under the rubble, then they risk the pieces of concrete falling apart, and that might have a very injurious effect on whoever's trapped. Let's remember that in the Haiti earthquake, where we had a very large but unknown number of people who were trapped, after day 5, only 9 people were rescued alive. And in the World Trade Center collapse in 2001, very few people were rescued at all. Indeed, almost no one, because the kinetic energy of it and the spontaneous nature of the collapse was so enormous. There simply wasn't the chance to rescue people. But here there is still a slim chance.
And are we closer in any sense to finding out what really happened, what caused this collapse?
Well, that will be the subject, no doubt, of meticulous investigation. There are plenty of other examples around the world to go on. This sort of thing happens quite commonly in places like Nigeria, for example, but it also happens in very many other countries very occasionally. So we've got a long record of different kinds of spontaneous building collapse, plus a vast amount of information of how buildings of this kind collapse during earthquakes, which they may do in enormous quantities even. So there'll be an engineering investigation of exactly what was wrong with the building, exactly how cracks propagated, how drainage was poor, and all the other things that we know something about, but perhaps not the entire story at this moment.
And would you expect building standards to be under the spotlight?
Well, I think every time there is a disaster of this kind, then building standards are scrutinized. And the question is always raised, do we want to improve them? That is true every time there's a large earthquake, there will be an enormous investigation and the results fed back. So we will have to see what is fed back into the Florida building codes, into the US standard building codes, and so on. And one thing we know about this is that climate change may be a factor, and it is being suggested now that building codes may have to be improved to take account of the effects of climate change.
Yeah, really good to get your expertise. David Alexander, thanks very much.
It's a pleasure.